In 2002, David Bowie released Heathen. He was 55 years old. And with Heathen, he entered yet another phase of his career. It was not an album on which he played a character, like on Ziggy Stardust, or tried to top the charts, like on Let's Dance, or adopted a style that was cutting edge and relevant, like on Outside. The album was him. It was, I think, truly and finally David Bowie. Not a persona, not a character, not a concept, him. You can feel it in the music. The album is a questing album, a searching album, an album about spiritual questions and problems. But unlike on other albums, like Station to Station, for instance, where there is nearly a sense of desperation, on Heathen, there is a mature and settled quality, a relaxed assurance, a sense that he is playing to himself, playing for himself, and content with who that self had become. We have been watching Bowie change from album to album, shift and mutate, adopt one persona after another. We have seen his sound and vision evolve over the decades, never running in any one groove for more than 2 or 3 albums. Bowie had always been looking for himself, or maybe better, his sense of self was based on looking for himself, as if to be a self were to be involved in a constant process of change and growth. On Heathen and on the 2003 follow-up album Reality, and I tend to think of these albums as being closely related, as being a distinct phase in his career, we feel Bowie arriving, feel him being. It is not that he was settling down, it was instead, I think, that his constant changing had finally earned him a sense of fulfillment. He was 55 years old. He was an elder statesman of popular music, a man who had seen and experienced much. He didn't have to play young artists' games anymore, but instead of cashing in on his considerable back catalog, instead of coasting on his success, as so many others have done, he was still making new music. It was like breathing to him. He couldn't not do it. The spiritual quest was still there, the searching for answers was still there, but the answers had become more complicated. In fact, Bowie was getting comfortable with the idea that the questions themselves might not have answers, but that simply looking for them was often enough. In September 2001, Bowie was in the studio making Heathen. He was recording in Allaire Studios, a sort of mountain retreat in the Catskill Mountains in New York State, when the planes flew into the Twin Towers. The contrast between the chaos in New York and the calm isolation of Allaire could not have been greater, but in a sense, Heathen is born of that contrast and contains it. Many people think Heathen is Bowie's 9/11 album, but most of it was actually written and completed before the attacks. 2003's Reality, with its great white scar over Battery Park, is Bowie's more explicit response to the attack and its aftermath. Outside, as we saw, was Bowie's direct response to the 90s, and to the seeming chaos and incoherence that marked the end of the century. It was an album that looked at the world. Heathen, like all good art, is also an artist's response to the world, but it is not so much about the world this time as about the artist, about the older and more mature artist, and about how the world and life affects him or her now. I think we had in the 90s far higher expectations of what the new century and new millennium would bring us, and I think thus far it's been the most utter disappointment. And almost there's a certain ominous quality to it, which is really quite scary. And I think having now brought children into this environment and in this world, it increasingly focuses one's thoughts on where the hell we are going and what kind of tragedy we are bringing upon ourselves. I'm actually very negative about these situations, much to my friend's disgruntlement. I don't think we evolve, and I don't think we've progressed, and I think we are bound to make all the same mistakes that we always make. It's as depressing as that. That laugh there, that laughing at how depressing everything is important. It's not glib, not dismissive or nihilistic, not hysterical. It's almost a philosopher's laugh, an artist's laugh, the laugh of experience and understanding and acceptance. The 9/11 attacks were not the only thing happening to Bowie then. They might not even have been the most important things. His mother had died only a few months earlier. He was, once again, a new father, this time to a baby girl. And he was getting old and thinking about old age. I mean, 55 is not ancient. Not really. But by pop music standards, it is. He was no longer a kid playing to kids. He was no longer even an adult playing to kids. He and his audience, the fans following him for decades, had grown up. And growing old in a young person's game like popular music can be a death sentence. So many musicians write themselves into irrelevance and self-parody by refusing to grow up, by pretending they are still young. Bowie himself had almost done this with Outside and Earthling. He had almost, but not quite, I think. Not quite. Looked ridiculous on stage with Trent Reznor and Nine Inch Nails. But with Heathen, Bowie avoided that trap. He stepped around it by embracing himself and his age. He was looking at life not as a young man, but as a 55-year-old. A young man looks at the world and sees tragedy, and he gets angry. An older man looks at the world and sees that the world has always been like that, and he laughs. Not because the world and the hurts of the world are funny, but because they are not new. And a 55-year-old philosopher artist can look at how we still make all the same mistakes that we always make and laugh. Can laugh at the world, laugh at himself, laugh at all the contradictions and complexities and conflicts. On Heathen's opening track, the prayerful and meditative Sunday, he sings, "Everything has changed, for in truth it's the beginning of nothing. And nothing has changed. Everything has changed. For in truth it's the beginning of an end. And nothing has changed. And everything has changed." It sounds contradictory. Everything has changed, nothing has changed. The beginning of nothing, the beginning of an end. It sounds confused, sounds almost hopeless and empty, but it isn't. Sunday does not attempt to solve these contradictions. Instead, it accepts them, is comfortable with them. This seeming confusion is a mature and prayerful response to everything Bowie has seen and lived through, a way of uniting and absorbing life's vagaries. Buildings fall down. Mothers pass away. But baby girls are also born. These things all happen at the same time. The world is contradiction and always has been, a place where the best and worst things possible occur side by side. A place with more questions than answers. I always write about the same things. I just approach them differently each time, I think. The subject matter is, I've got this thematic device, really, that I've used ever since the 60s, which is basically the isolation of the human and how he stands in relation to his universe and how he struggles to find some connection with it. I think they're really big questions and impossible ones to answer, but it doesn't stop a writer forever posing them and trying to answer them or trying to get near. Bowie was not a religious person, not in the traditional sense at least, but he was a questing soul, someone who examined those impossible to answer really big questions. And he did so as the perpetual outsider, the heathen, the alien artist who feels like he is alone against the world. Nothing has changed. Everything has changed. It was true of the world and true of Bowie himself. He was always a heathen, always someone outside the mainstream who felt himself alone the way all great philosophers and artists feel they are alone. And his songs were always part of a spiritual quest, tackling those really big questions. Nothing has changed. Everything has changed. In 2003 and 2004, Bowie was on the Reality Tour, a 10-month worldwide tour covering 24 countries. Bowie's tours had always been theatrical events, full of spectacular sound and vision. But on the Reality Tour, that sense that Bowie was now being instead of becoming, that sense that he had grown into a version of himself that was authentically him and not a persona or character, shone through. He was perfectly in command of himself and his material and comfortable and joyous on stage. His friends and bandmates recall that they had never known Bowie to be so happy and content. The tour was a celebration and a triumph. It was also his last tour. His final live performance occurred on June 25, 2004, in Hamburg, Germany. He suffered a mild heart attack on stage. Nobody knew this, though. He just kept singing and playing. He had already been having health problems and had nearly collapsed on stage several times. After heroically finishing the show, he did collapse immediately backstage and was rushed to the hospital, where he underwent surgery for a blocked artery. The Starman was mortal. The remaining 14 tour dates were canceled, and he never toured again. He was not, however, finished. All his life he had been changing who he was and had more or less been in charge of those changes, choosing them deliberately. Now a change was being forced upon him, but the next day would take 10 years to arrive.